my current research is about women's leadership and about women's representation in Indonesia. And today, I will be the moderator for our meeting entitled Legitimacy and Protest under Authoritarianism, Comparative Perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, all the students, regarding to our topic, has come with us, Dr. Johannes Garchewski, or you can call him Pak Johannes. Currently, he's a lecturer and researcher at WZB and Free University Berlin. Before your presentation, Johannes, maybe I can say two things. I would like to say two things. First, that almost all of the audience today are undergraduate students, and the second one is a request, if you don't mind. Maybe you can speak slowly because English is not our main language, and because there are various language skills of student. Is that okay, Johannes? Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
For reminding me. Thank you.
Okay. And for the participant, I would like to remind you, if you want to ask later, please raise your hand first, and it will be good if all the participants who can speak slowly, don't have problem with internet connection, to turn on your video during this session. Okay. So thank you, Johannes, for being with us again. This is your fourth meeting with us. You will have 60 minutes for your presentation. Please, Johannes, the platform is yours.
Yeah, Chavita, thanks a lot. Thank you for the nice introduction. And if I remember correctly, you said at one point that you're the only female professor, wasn't it? Is it true? And the director
yes.
now?
Yes, I'm the head of this department now.
The head of the department, so that's cool. My congratulations. And I do hope that there will be more female professors joining you soon.
Yeah.
I assume that some of you have seen me before. So as Chavita said, it's the fourth time that I talked to you, but it was to the lecturers and professors, and then there was a welcome speech. So I assume that some of you know me already, but some of you are new in this round. So I say just very brief things on me. As Chavita said, I work in Berlin, in Germany. I'm there for the last 15 years or so. I did my PhD in Berlin and did a postdoc there. I was abroad in the UK and the US, but always came back to Berlin because that's the place I like to work and like to be. And I teach now at Free University, and my research and teaching interests both are in comparative politics. So I compare across cases usually. And I work on questions of democratizations, so how regimes become democratic, and on autocratic regimes, so non-democratic regimes. That's my main work, my main area of expertise. And I was asked to give a lecture here on a topic that is actually very close to my heart somehow. So that's something that I do a lot, or what really interests me, and that's the question of protest and legitimacy in authoritarian regimes. So I'm going to start a PowerPoint presentation soon, but just to give a brief introduction to situate you a bit at the beginning. So the overall idea is the puzzle, how ordinary citizens, like normal people, like you and me, like the butcher around the corner, the baker, the workers, all kinds of people, I don't know, my parents, my family, all kind of normal people, when they live in an authoritarian regime. So for Germany, it was in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic until the 1990, 1989. But then, of course, we have a very, very terrible history. And there's always a debate how these normal people, actually, the ordinary people, behave in these authoritarian regimes in a very repressive environment, and if they actually believe in what the authoritarian regime tells them, why they are entitled to rule. So what, in very concrete terms, in a communist regime as in the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, did people believe in this communist ideology? Or did they say, okay, I don't mind what they tell me. So, it's just, they can tell whatever they want to, but in my private, I make fun about them and don't believe in them. So that's the question. And I assume that in Indonesia, you had similar questions. So how many people believed in Suharto and Sukarno and in what they proposed? How many believe now? So I do a bit on China and North Korea. So, do they follow the Chinese party kind of directions? So that's the overall topic of today, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And I will bring you an empirical example that I did with a colleague. So I first say something very broad about legitimacy and autocratic regimes. And then I bring you a concrete empirical example that I did with a colleague that is in a completely different area. That was the so-called Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings. I assume you remember. So that was some years ago, very, very huge protests, like millions of people protesting in the streets and demanding the downfall of the autocratic regime. So we had a look at Egypt and Morocco, two countries in the region, and we did a survey among students, so people like you, why they went to the streets and why they protested. So, and then I tell you how we did it and what results we had. But before we do this, I need to say some kind of words at the very beginning about legitimacy and autocratic regimes, but that will be the topic of today. Also, okay, now there are now 266 people, so maybe I should not look how many people actually listen to me. Maybe I should just not do this. But I could assume that it's difficult for you afterwards to speak up. So because now it's also kind of challenging for me to speak in front of so many people. So you could also write something in the chat afterwards if that's easier for you. Or you could also, so that's what we had yesterday. If you don't feel comfortable asking in English, then write in your write in your language. So that's also fine. So we can. I assume that Jovita and Pasha and others could translate it as well. So this is just to say that feel encouraged to ask questions, although it might be challenging with so many people listening to you. Let me share the screen. So now you should see the screen, I assume. So my PowerPoint slides. And also if I'm too, and I thank you, Jovita, for reminding me that I sometimes speak too fast. But if there's something that you would like me to clarify, you could also stop me right away and ask me something while I speak. So as I said, the structure of the talk is about the concepts, and I guess some of you attended yesterday's talk. And there I made it was very important for me and also my colleagues, and in the discussion with you students, it became very important that the concepts we use are more than just words, but there's something behind these words, and we need to uncover the semantic meaning, what's behind these concepts. So that's why I say something on autocratic regime, what it is actually, or how we could make sense of it. And then I talk about legitimacy. I'm not sure how familiar you are with these terms. Legitimacy is a very, so it's a Western word to some extent. It's a Latin word from old Latin, but it's extremely important for understanding political regimes, and I guess that's why it has such a central place, but also for democracies as well, for sure. And then after having the concept straight, I talk about why it matters in autocratic regimes, and then talk about protest and talk about the actual study that I did with a friend and colleague. Crescent Thun is her name. So that's the structure of the talk today. Let me start with what's going on now in Germany, where I live. So as you might have read in the newspaper or online, we just had elections. The elections took place on Sunday, national elections for the chancellor. You might know Angela Merkel. I assume that she's well known in the world. She was our chancellor for the last 16 years. And now she stepped down, and it was the first elections after her very, very long tenure. So very surprisingly, her party, the Conservative Party, lost, and they lost really a lot. So they dropped around 9%, from something like 34% to 24% or 25%. And that was surprising, and that was really a big loss for the Conservative Party. So the Conservative is like center-right. And the Social Democratic Party won, and the reaction of the Social Democratic Party was like this. So they've been very surprised, and they've been extremely happy, and that's a picture that was made at 6 o'clock in the evening, when the first forecasts have been broadcasted on television. So you see the joy and the happiness and the Social Democratic Party overtaking the incumbent Conservative Party. The reaction of the Conservative candidate, that's him. The party is called the CDU, the Christ Democratic Union. You see that he was kind of disappointed, and the people standing behind him are also very disappointed by the results. Now there's a debate to what extent, or there was a debate in the last days. The guy here, the candidate of the losing party, did not congratulate the winning candidate. And now you could say, okay, who cares? So he just didn't congratulate him. So why bother? So he just lost. So maybe he's just also a bit sad and disappointed. But there is more to this debate. It's not about only being polite and congratulating your rival, but it's more a question also for the democratic game, and that's what I want to highlight here. There are various definitions of what a democracy is actually. So, and I'm not going to talk about this today. So you have really a lot of different definitions. One definition that I like the most, but me personally, so that's only my opinion, is one in which Adam Przeworski said that democracy is organized uncertainty and ruled open-endedness. So what he says is that it's at the core of a democracy that you don't know the results before. So it's uncertain what's going to happen, but you organize it in a way that the results are uncertain, but that everyone believes that the elections are fair. So that's the fairness in the institution. And you as a loser, if you lost the elections, say to yourself, okay, this time I lost, but the process was so fair that I'm going to compete the next time. And that's kind of a reinforcing logic of a democracy. So democracy is about losing and about the loser accepting the loss and accepting that he or she or the party has lost in the election. So it's not only about the majority winning, but it's about the minority accepting the loss. Now I need to say that now it became, or the candidate of the Conservative Party said that he wrote a letter to the winning Social Democratic candidate in Germany. Might be true, so I assume that he did. But if you look to the US, to Trump contesting the elections, not accepting his loss even now after so much time, that's a kind of break with the democratic rules. So that's very difficult from a democratic standpoint, so that he does not believe in the fairness of the institution here of the election. So democracy is about good losing or good losers. It's about fair losers. It's about, like in sports, when you lost a football game, then you congratulate the others, but you believe that that it was a level playing ground that you played on. Now, if we accept that the democracies have this uncertainty and this element of uncertainty that you do not know what's going to happen, we could say in a similar way that autocracies are the contrast to it, and they are organizing certainty. So an autocrat, a dictator, what he does is that he fears surprises. You know what happens at 6 o'clock when the first forecast is on the television? That's the moment of maximum uncertainty. A dictator, cannot stand this uncertainty, and he wants to do all he can, and it's almost all dictators are men, so it's almost always him, and he does all he can to avoid any surprises. So he knows the elections beforehand, and what they do is all kinds of manipulation. So what they do is to organize certainty, and now in this, when they want to organize certainty, what do they need to do? So what they need to do is, what do the people think? What do the ordinary people think? So, I need to control what the baker, the butcher, the worker, all kinds of the neighbor around the corner, what they think. I need to know what the opposition does. And what the opposition does is something that, they want to repress by putting them in jail, by, like curtailing political rights, civil rights, all kinds of repressive measures. And they want to know what the elite does. So say important military leaders, business leaders. And what they want to do is that they want to co-opt, that they want to bring the leaders into their regime, so that the leaders do not overthrow the regime. What I do now in this talk is that I look mostly on the people, as I said at the very beginning. So I'm interested in the normal, ordinary people doing their usual daily stuff. And the question, to what extent an authoritarian regime, say the Chinese, are able to gain a following among the people, that the people living in the cities and in the villages think, okay, I believe that these regimes, or that the Chinese Communist Party is right in what it does, and I follow this regime. So I'm a supporter, I'm a fan somehow, at least support the regime. That's the question of legitimacy. And now I said to you already that legitimacy is a Latin word, and in a very normative understanding, when you say a rule is legitimate, you would say it's right, it's fair, it's just, it's good, it's for the good of the people, and so on. So that's usually what we think of legitimacy, and that it's in accordance with the laws that are out there. So there is the Latin legi intimus, and I don't know if you had Latin at any time, but also from the English you could see. So lex legis, legal in English, is the law, and intimus is being close, so to be intimate or something in English as well. So that's the origin of the word, so that it's very close to the laws, and the laws demanding that it's a good rule, and that they have a license to govern the regime. Now, the obvious question is, if we apply these standards, these yardsticks, and I assume that we all in this room agree that democratic rule is what we support. So, assuming that we all Democrats, like privately and politically in our political opinion, then the question arises: can we speak of a legitimate autocratic rule? So you see the obvious tension there. So, you know, can you speak of a fair, right, just, good rule when the ruler represses his people, when they, you know, do harm to their people, do harm to the opposition, are super corrupt, and all of these kind of things? Now, from a normative point, from our own political beliefs, it would be impossible to do so. But from a more empirical point of view, you know, kind of stripping away all what we think privately about politics, it might be possible to talk about it, because there might be people in China and other places that actually find these regimes legitimate. And what you do then is that you often try to hark back to people, to kind of social theory and very important figures in the field. And a very famous German sociologist is Max Weber. And he said, we should not look at things in a normative way. So, you know, we should not ask ourselves how it should be or how a rule ought to be, not how we desire it to be, but rather just, you know, look at it how it is. What do we see empirically? So not normatively, but very empirically and analytically. And that's what I want to do now. So if you feel uneasy that I speak of a legitimate autocracy, and you think, boy, that's really too much for me to speak of a legitimate autocracy, then I can understand you from a normative point of view, but I do have an empirical point of view. So, you know, I'm not, in no way I would like to make the impression that I myself as a person would support the Chinese regime or any kind of autocratic regime. But I just look what's happening there on the ground somehow. So it's a strictly empirical usage. I just ask, do people, maybe due to propaganda, maybe due to the indoctrination, maybe due to the education system, the way they are socialized in this country, do they accept the autocracy, the Communist Party, the military dictatorship, the king, the monarch? Do they accept them as, you know, legitimate? So it's a very empirical usage that I have. Weber says that there are three types. So he says people could believe in the righteousness of the rule because of the charisma of the leader. We have a very charismatic person. Maybe in China it was Mao Zedong, who people thought that he was almost divine, almost godlike. So he was a very charismatic figure, and also the personality cult around him, you know, all these big portraits and pictures and all of this propaganda for him, showing his charisma. people could also believe that the rule is legitimate because of tradition. You know, say in a monarchy, it has always been the case for decades, for centuries. I just believe in the norms and the rules that have been out there for so many years. So that's based on tradition. But it could also be legal rational, and that would be more on the democratic side, that you believe the laws are fair and the procedures are fine with you. So these are basic types of legitimate rule. And it might be that at one point in your studies you have heard already about them. If not, then you hear them now. It's a question of why do you, as one who is ruled, you know, who needs to accept political decisions, why you accept these political decisions. So in a very general term, the political always means that decisions are made that are beyond the individual case, and people need to accept these decisions. So that's why legitimacy is so important. Now, it's important, if I come back to the Chinese example, that there is a match between what the Chinese government says, so that's the claim of the ruler, and the belief of the ruled, and what the people believe. So if they advertise equality, that's what the people need to believe. So there need to be a certain match. And in this very empirical usage, it's important for both democracies and autocracies. So that's the starting point here. So now you have a bit of an idea what an autocracy is. So it's a system that tries to rule out any kind of chance. A dictator fears surprises. He wants to control the people. He wants to control the opposition. He wants to control the elite. We focus now on what they do to the people. You know, the legitimacy question. And now you could say, yeah, okay, legitimacy, fine, fair enough. But actually, I think that it doesn't really matter in an autocracy. And now I show you why it actually matters. And the example that I give to you is protest events. So, and when you read the newspaper now, you see a lot of protest events in autocratic regimes happening. So think of Belarus, actually mostly women being leading the protests. You could think of Hong Kong students leading the protests, and a lot of other people joining against, how you would say it, against the Chinese influence. You have all kinds of protests happening, and what I focus on was one of the biggest in the last years that started in Tunisia by this one, if you remember, it was a shop owner who burned himself openly at a square, igniting protest afterwards. So, and that was the Arab uprising that happened some years ago, and that swept across the region, starting in Tunisia, but then going to other places as well. So the question that we had was, if low levels of legitimacy, if people do not see the regime as justified, if that leads to protest. In other words, if the attitudes people have translate to actual political behavior. So here I just took random pictures, so but there you see how massive these protests are. Now people are a bit more sobered, or the conclusions are a bit more sobering. The high hopes that we had for democracies are a bit disappointed now. but still, you know, we focus on the protests here. It was a project, and that with a friend and colleague of mine, and I would like to give her credit to it, because she is actually the expert on the region. I'm more from the theory side. And we did this project together, and what I tell you is based on this article that I put here. But Gressen she works now in Bremen in Germany, and we used to be colleagues in Berlin, and we did this study together. But I need to say that she is really the expert in the region, and also an expert on the substance. So that's just that I want to not say that I did it myself. But what we did in our analysis, and that was mostly her work, that we asked 1,600, 1,700 university students like you, actually the same age than you, in the two capital cities of Morocco and Egypt. So it was in Rabat and in Cairo. We went into the universities. There was a certain sampling method, and so multi-stage and clustered. That's a bit technical. That's something we don't need to discuss in detail, but we entered the universities, the seminar rooms, asked students to participate in a survey that we designed particularly to test or to ask them for political attitudes in a repressive context. And now you could imagine that it's very difficult. So if I ask a Chinese person or any other person in an autocratic context, that they might have fears to answer honestly what's happening. So they might, they might fear repression, they might fear that it's not anonymous, that, so they have a incentive to hide what they actually think. And the timing that we had for the survey was very fortunate, because it happened in February to April 2013. And that was a period in which the former dictator was out of office. The dictators were Mubarak was out of office in Egypt. And there was a period where people felt relieved and felt emancipated from it. So we assume that the preference falsification was a bit lower than usual, but it troubles our analysis. Also, it troubles our analysis that we only looked at students, so people like you as the most and the best educated, also in Rabat and Cairo, leading universities like UB and the universities where you come from. To some extent, there are students like you who are the smartest in the country, and that might not be representative for all of what's happening in the country. We justify it a bit by saying that these protests were led mostly by students. But we are very cautious to say what the students actually told us is what the whole population believed. It's really only what the students believed and why it mattered that they went to the streets and protested and kind of really also risked their lives. So you could, for the reminder of the talk, also think a bit about, so you're not living in an authoritarian context, but assume that you would assume that you were living in Morocco or Egypt, and you would be in the same situation than your fellow students there. What would drive you to the streets? So, and I'm going to tell you the questions that we asked and the empirical results that we got. So that's just the background for the analysis. So what you need to know is that we asked students like you in Rabat and Cairo had a lot of questions to them and asked them, why did you participate? Why did you go to the streets? Why did you really risk your life, or kind of fear, at least repression? So that's the stage for this. I also need to say that we asked them in 2013, and they needed to say what they did in 2011. So, you know, it's also a bit of a problem that it's 2 years after they did something, they need to reflect. But we assumed it was such a big decision for them to protest in the streets that, you know, they can easily remember what happened back then. So our theoretical expectation, and that's the connecting to the first part of my talk, we assumed that it has a lot to do with the legitimacy of the ruling regime in Morocco and in Egypt. So that people did not believe in what the regime stands for. So if we go back to the Communist Party in China, the legitimacy formula of the Communist Party would be something like communism, nationalism, development, economic growth. So, you know, that's what they propagate. That's what they tell their people. In Morocco and Egypt, it's a bit different. So they don't appeal to communism and the legacy of communism and socialism and so on, but they rather refer to very religious and traditional ideals. And I tell you what we asked them, but these traditional religious ideals are something like, to what extent religion should be in politics, and very nationalist sentiments as well. So particularly in Egypt, that's a very nationalist account. The other rivaling hypotheses are cognitive politicization, and I tell you what this is in a second, and grievance approach. The other one I'm not putting too much emphasis on because I'm restricted a bit on time, but the cognitive politicization is a psychological approach that says people go to the streets if they are interested in politics. So you would need to ask them, you know, do you read the newspaper? Do you inform yourself regularly? So they must be interested in politics. They must be informed about politics. And they must, so, you know, that they know what's going on, and that they must be able to, or that they believe in the efficacy of their actions. So, you know, that they can actually change things. If you believe, well, I don't mind, I don't play any role in the politics, then it doesn't matter. If you think that you're so irrelevant without any influence, then you would not go to the street. So that's a kind of an thinking of political efficacy. Sorry, I just need to. The grievance approach, as the second big rival, is that people are going to the streets because they are frustrated, feeling of deprivation, you know, they are unemployed, they want to have more money, they want to have better chances in education, and so on. So that's, you know, they have grievances, and that's why they go to the street. The mobilizing structures and the resources is more, the mobilizing structures is to what extent they are organized. So we ask them, are you a member of a party? Are you a member of a student association? And any kind of mobilizing structure. That would also explain why they go to the streets. So all I'm saying is also, you could, while I say this, you could test yourself if you would, if you would go to the streets. If you would go to the streets when you feel politicized because you believe that you can change something, if you feel unemployment would drive you, or if you feel the organizational structure you're in, the club, the association, the party, the union, would drive you to the streets. Resources means mainly income. So if you're well off, then you would go to the streets. Family background would mean what your parents did. So, if you're middle class, upper, lower class person, and gender, it's also, so if it matters if you're male or female. So these are all explanations that you find in the literature, and they are very prominently discussed, and they are applied to a lot of different places. What I do, or what we did, I need to say, what we did was to apply these to Morocco and to Egypt. So we asked the students the following battery of questions, and I go through the battery of questions, and that gives you an idea about, what, so it gives very concrete idea what legitimacy means. So on a religious traditional basis, you would ask people, politics should be based on religion. Religion should not be mixed with politics. My partner does not necessarily have to share my religion. Women should have the same hereditary rights as men, and too much Western, so that's Christian influence, is not good for a society. So these are questions that we ask the students. So how religious traditional are you? So what's your belief? The more nationalist values, Egypt or Morocco, should be more active in trying to solve conflicts in other countries. So that they should be more active in the region. So the nation being very, very strong in the region. International aid is usually just used as a pretext to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs or Morocco's internal affairs. The United Nations only act in the interest of rich countries and not ours. Also again, very strong, our nation needs to be strong. Our government should be more cautious when accepting funds from the United States. The European Union interferes too much in our country's political development through their funding. So you see, we ask the students about their beliefs and then see to what extent these beliefs are matched with what the autocratic regime actually said. Here we took very religious and traditional values because that's very prominent. Particularly what in Morocco is proclaimed, and nationalist values, that's in both cases, but also a bit more in Egypt. So that's what they publicly say. And now we ask them, do you believe in these in these items, and to see if they match. On the performance of authorities and institutions, so a bit lower level, we ask them about the performance of the government. So if they think that the government does a good job, actually. And the questions here was where the government took the demands of the protesters seriously. Elections in this country are held in a free and fair manner. Political parties generally keep their promises. The police would never use violence on innocent people. The military will always protect the security of the people in this country. So what we ask here is to what extent students in these countries accept certain institutions, government institutions, as legitimate. So we ask for the government, we ask for parties, the police, and the military. So these are questions of legitimacy. So the one on a very ideological basis, religion, tradition, national sentiment, and here it's more about the actual performance of these institutions. So that's what I showed you before. That was our main hypothesis, that this explains why people went to the streets. Now I tell you something about the first two other approaches, cognitive politicization and grievance. And you could also think by yourself if that would drive you to the streets as well. Or if that would be something, that would not trigger you actually. As I said, it's a more psychological explanation that is a combination of political interest, political information, and belief in efficacy. So political interest and political information is very easy to ask. So you ask students, are you interested in politics? Do you follow the news? Do you read the newspapers? Or do you read online newspapers? So that's very easy. The belief in the efficacy are questions like this. So we ask them the following questions. Sometimes, and they need to rate from 1 to 4 if they agree or disagree. So they say, or we ask them, sometimes politics seems so complicated that a person like me cannot really understand what is going on. People like me don't have any say in what the government does. Politics disgust me, so I don't want to have anything to do with them. I don't really care who is in the government as long as I can live peacefully. So you see, these are questions very much asking them, do you actually believe you going to the street could make a difference, could change something? And in order to assume that you could change something, you would need to be interested and informed. So that's the cognitive politicization. The other one in the other big rival explanation on grievance is we asked these 1,600 students in the two capitals and in several universities, in your view, how important are the following issues for the immediate future? And then in socioeconomic terms, it was about unemployment, it was access to education and social inequality. So, these are pressing issues. And in political are stability, gender equality, human rights, political participation, personal freedoms, corruption, reduce corruption, and they had a constitution process going on. So grievance is about people being frustrated, or being kind of disenchanted or being deprived of their opportunities. So they're really going protest in anger but certain topics, unemployment or education and so on. And what we get then from these 1,700 students is the surveys. They did this actually on paper because they trusted paper more than online. So they said we said then, it's better in paper so that they don't fear that something is done with the data online, digital data and so on, that someone traces it. So we did it on paper. You go through all of these and you create a database. So 1,600, 1,700 students, all of the items, I don't know how many there were, let's say 100 or 50 or something of these items. And then you begin a data analysis. And I'm not going to talk about the concrete steps in the data analysis because that sometimes, you get lost in the technicalities. But in order to give you an idea, what we did is that we reduce complexity. So, that we have all these different items, and we use that's called factor analysis. So we reduce the complexity of it, and it comes to the main variables that we have. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with reading regression analyses, but you could also look up in the paper. So I'm not going to go through it now, but I just want to show you that's how this logistic regression works. The question was, did you go to the streets? Yes, no, binary, so that's the outcome. And you have all of those variables that you see here on the left-hand side. These are the questions that we ask them. You know, they should explain why they went to the street. So the legitimacy, what we talked about, the grievance, so that they are upset, the cognitive politicization, that's that they believe that they can do a change, but then also the organizational membership, the education of parents, the household income, and female. So you know what I talked you through. You would see almost always similar questions for different protests. So that, you know, you could apply these explanations to protests in Belarus, but also to protests in Hong Kong, protests in Myanmar. So these are very common approaches. And for me, it was important to familiarize you with these explanations, why people go to the streets. And it was important for me to give you a bit of an idea how this is done. So for us, it was university students in the two capitals. On paper, they need to fill in stuff. But we also experienced that sometimes they, even on paper, and even in a situation where the dictator was out of office, they did not want to answer some delicate questions. So that happened still in this period, that they, for reasons that we can only speculate, they did not answer questions, say, on religion, or say on, do they trust the military, or do they trust the police? So there are things that they still did not like to answer, which of course is understandable. The empirical results that we had was that legitimacy did have an independent effect. And that was, of course, very important for us, because that was the major hypothesis that we wanted to test. In Morocco, it was more the religious traditional sentiments and an underperformance of the institution, so that they did not trust the military and the police and the party. Whereas in Egypt, it was more nationalism. And interestingly enough, students went to the streets because they thought their government is not nationalistic enough. So they said that they should not be so close to the US, so close to the European Union, and so on. So what drove them to the street was that the nation of Egypt should be independent, should be stronger. That was the main empirical effect that we found for this country. Or no, it's not for the country, but for the students, actually. So I need to say that it's for the students. Socioeconomic grievances did have an effect, but in statistical terms, it was not significant. This political interest and cognitive politicization had an effect, and significant effect. Also, the organization played a big role. So if you were part in a club or association, in a union, that had an effect that drove them to the streets. The resources was a bit diverging, so there was no clear picture that we had in the end. So resources means, you know, household income. So the better well off you are, the more you go to the streets. So these were our empirical results that we found. They might diverge for other countries. It was here only important for me to give you an idea of, you know, how in political science protest is explained. So you have grievance, you have a psychological approach, You have the legitimacy approach that I talk mostly about. You have also organizational structure, income, gender, education background, and so on. So these are the drivers for protests, and I wanted to make clear that these are the theories that you can apply to an empirical case, and the empirical case for us was Morocco and Egypt. So in the project with my friend and colleague Crescentine. So to sum up, what was important for me are two things. If you remember at the beginning, I talked about legitimacy, and also that it's difficult in a normative, from a normative point of view, to say that there is a fair, a just rule, a righteous rule in an autocracy. But if you have a very empirical usage and you only ask them in the sense of Max Weber, then you could apply it. So then it's okay to apply it. So it matters in autocracies as much as it does in democracies. People, for various reasons, believe in things that we might not want that they believe in, like personally, as only a person. Or yeah, I guess that holds true for most of us. And it was important for me to say that it explains real life events like protests. So attitudes that people have really drives real life events, drives protests. And I explained to you the various explanations that are out there. And we particularly were interested if autocratic regime loses its legitimacy, people do not believe any longer that they are justified to rule, if that explains protest. And as I showed you for the two cases, it actually did for Morocco and for Egypt. So let me close here. I really look forward to your questions. We do have time to get in an exchange about these topics. As I said, I could understand that you do not dare to speak up, but nevertheless, I would be very happy if you have the courage to do so that we get in an exchange here. Also, or type it. That's just open. But I would really like to invite you to ask the questions that you might have on this topic. I thank you for listening, and really look forward to questions you might have. So I stop sharing the screen and
okay.
See how Jovita, it's up to you now to moderate the discussion. So thank you for doing this.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Johannes. But before I open the Q&A session, I have read your article and I want to clarify a concept. In your article, it is written the existence of political community distinguished from regime institution. Who is exactly the political community is, and what is the criteria of this group, and can we conclude this group as middle class groups? Johannes?
Oh, Jovita, thanks a lot. Thanks also for reading the article and taking interest in the article. It's a super question, excellent question. And it's true that I have not made this clear also now in the presentation, so it's good that I can take this. And it was a concern that we had when we wrote this article, or when we actually designed the whole project. So it's really an excellent question that you raise here. We thought the following, that there is a difference in asking people for a concrete institution like the police or the military or a political party, compared to, on a very general basis, the question of ideology, of religion, or of these values that people have. So the one is very concrete. So that's the police, the military, the people that work in these institutions. Whereas the other is a bit more vague. It's about it's your own attitude, so it's a bit more diffuse. And we rely on a concept by David Easton. He makes a difference between diffuse and specific types of support. And the diffuse support is more on values, and the political community is about the we feeling that we as a nation, for example, have. So we as the German nation, or we as the Indonesian nation, we share certain beliefs and values. So that's the political community. It could be also we as a religious group, but that's the idea that Easton calls a we feeling. So, a sense of a common identity that you as a nation or as a cultural entity or as a religious group that you have. So that's the political community. And the questions that we asked was about religion and about the nation. Whereas the institutions are more, to what extent do you trust the police, that they don't beat you up in the streets without having any reason, so that they do not use violence against you? Or to what extent do you believe that the military is neutral? So we thought when designing this project that we should keep them separate. The one is very diffuse and believes and vague about a community, and the other one is more concrete and more specific about a more concrete institution. So that's why we made this difference. Jovita, does this answer your question?
Okay. So political community is more about feeling as a community.
Yeah, exactly. So about, you identify as a member of a nation, or you identify as a member of a religion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your explanation, Johannes. Okay, now we are come to the Q&A session. Besides questions, I think opinions are allowed for all the participants. If there's someone who want to ask a question, please raise your hand first, or you can also write it in the chat box. Let's see through my screen. There are, wait. Okay, there are many participants who want to ask. I will choose based on who raises hand first. Who raises hand first?
I think
okay.
That's impossible now.
Okay, maybe I will give the first chance to Nadila Iskandar, the second chance to Rizky Septianto, and the third chance to Pak Fajar. Okay, Nadila Iskandar, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Bu Juwita. As we hardly know, the uprising in China mostly happened because China is one of the countries that applied one country to systems such as communist, and in the other hand, such a liberal system. So the patterns of a political attitude is based about the ideological. The question is it possible that if the majority of society do uprising, but only based on certain ideology can change the political legitimacy? Thank you, sir. That's my question. Thank you.
Nadila, great. Thanks a lot. Excellent question. And I think it also connects very good to what Jovita said. So, an ideology like what you refer to, the communist ideology, or nowadays it would be difficult for the Chinese to call them communist, because they do have the Communist Party, and they do follow some communist principles, but still, they are very pragmatic, and they have a market and a capitalist system, and so it's kind of a mixture now between socialism and capitalism. But that's their ideology now that they have. And in a related project that I did with another colleague, is that we looked at what the Chinese actually tell to their people. You know, what do you find in the publications? And we took the most important propaganda newspaper that they have, and we took like party material, and there you see very clearly that the ideology changes. So they used to be extremely communist and had extremely communist language, but now it becomes more and more capitalist and nationalist actually as well. So it's difficult to always find out what an autocratic regime actually, or how it wants to portray itself. You know, what's the legitimacy claim of the regime? But in any case, what every autocratic regime wants to do is that with this ideology, now communism or socialism, or it could also be based on religion or ethnicity, or it could be fascism, could be National Socialism in Germany. So all of these ideologies try to create a group, and that's the community, you know. And the question that we asked is, do people feel that they belong to this group? Do they identify to this group? And now it would be very interesting to do the same survey in China than we did. I don't know, maybe later in my academic career, I'm going to do it. But that would be there. So, you know, you would need to apply the explanations that we have for the Chinese case. And there is some data. So I'm not saying that no one has done it before. And in China, what you see is a very big paradoxical situation, actually, that a majority of Chinese have a very strong trust in their government, in their national government, and they trust the Communist Party, and actually believe also in this ideology, and this socialism and capitalist ideology, that, you know, China will be great again and will be kind of economically prosperous. But they really mistrust their local politics, their local politicians, like the delegates of the party on the lower levels. Now it's important to know that the Chinese people can vote or can elect the local people, but have no real say on the national level. Still, they trust the national level more than the local level. And that's kind of paradoxical, because you could also say, okay, if you could choose the people on the local level, you know, then you choose the best, and that's the one you trust the most. Whereas, you know, those corrupt national elites in the Communist Party that fill their pockets, you would mistrust them, and you have no influence on them. But in China, we see this very difficult situation, or paradoxical situation. So it's not easy to explain it. So that would be, you know, the Chinese case. But yeah, so China is always difficult, as you know, Nadila. I think that's so many puzzles in China, and that's really one among them. And thank you for pointing to this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Rizky Septianto.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. Okay, I would like to ask about Mr. Johansson's past research in Morocco and in Egypt. Do you think there is a link between your research with the government coup that happened in Egypt at that time? Or at least, can you tell us the causal effect between the government coup in Egypt with your research, with your past research at that time? Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Rizky. I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, so my apologies. Thank you for the question. It's also good, and a good question, really to the point, that was troubling us. As you can imagine, it was a difficult situation to do research. And I need to say that Gressen, the co-author that I told you about, she was actually the one being in these countries, and she has been there regularly, and she's an expert in this kind of, also worked there for many years and speaks Arabic fluently. So she was on the ground and did the field work. But it was a very, very difficult situation in this time. So it was in the beginning of 2013. The protests started in 2011. It was a period in which in Egypt Mubarak was ousted from office. These huge protests happening, and everyone being very politicized. So, and in this moment, in this particular moment when we asked them, it was really a moment of hope. And the students that we asked, believed in change and were really kind of in a period where they thought, now it's going to the better, the democratic future is there, and we really made it. So, we really ousted the president. So we brought the old regime to fall. So there is as you referred to, there is a bit of a problem that they might overemphasize, or that they might be biased in saying why they actually went to the streets, because it was 2 years later, and they might be euphoric and they might be very enthusiastic about it, so they might overestimate some aspects. That's a problem. But the only thing that you can do if you have this kind of survey is ask them, and you need to deal with these questions, but there's no way of really finding out if that was true or not. So you just need to you report the results, and then you interpret the results, and then you say, okay, we are aware that it was 2 years later, and they judge why they went to the streets. We also need to assume that they were honest, of course, in their answers. You could also raise doubts, so they could also say 2 years later, I missed, or I was not brave enough to go to the streets, but now 2 years later, I just do as if I were protesting. It could be that they thought, I'm still not sure about what's going to happen. I don't trust those German people. I fear a bit that something's going to happen, that it's not anonymous, and I do ask, or I do answer the questions in a way that is desired, and that might be desired by the former autocratic regime because they fear future repression. It might be desired because, okay, they think I'm a bright student in a super university, so I can't say that God, or that religion should be the guiding force in politics. It could, all these kind of things could happen. The question is always if it's so systematic that it really biases your results. And there we discuss these things. But of course, it was a difficult situation. Also, it's not it's also a bit improvised sometimes. If you go to the universities, and it was difficult to get access to the universities, to go to the classrooms, you would need to have a lot of contacts, and this was only possible because Gressen, my colleague, has worked at the university in Rabat for many years. So it's also about having these connections and getting access to these institutions. Yeah, but you're right. It was difficult, and there might be things that you could criticize in the survey, but it's almost inherent in it, and difficult to change. So yeah, thanks for the question. Cool, great.
Okay, Rizky, do you want to give a feedback? Rizky?
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you so much for the answer.
Okay.
It's very clear. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
I guess I also raised some questions, so.
Okay, silakan Pak
I guess.
Fajar.
That I couldn't answer all of it, but it's really some open questions for us as well. Yeah. Okay, Fajar.
Okay, Johannes, I'm interested in the cognitive aspects. These aspects, of course, is influenced by various factors. Media, for example, is play a hegemonic role even in democratic countries. How are the media settings in the case or countries that you research? Maybe you remember Khalid Said case in Egypt that killed by Egyptian police, and the case was widespread. Is media play a significant role to mobilize protest or strengthen legitimacy? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Fajar. Again, now that we talk so many times, again, a very challenging excellent question. On this cognitive politicization and the role of the media that you rightly referred to, it is a major. So let's put it like this: most of the protest literature that you read on protest movements, social movements, is done, or the majority is done in very democratic contexts. So it's about social movements for, I don't know now, climate change, or any kind of women's rights, or social movements in favor of now Black Lives Matter. And the social movement literature is often assuming to some extent that there is a media that is out there and that reports in a fair fashion somehow, that is independent, and that this cognitive politicization approach relies on in the first instance, you are interested in politics. So you, for whatever reasons, you have an interest in what's going on. Second, you are informed by it. And then third, you believe that you can make a change. But often the second point of, kind of being informed in a way that you really know what's going on, so that the newspaper provide you with the right information. That's, in these autocratic settings, of course, a difficult assumption. And even in 2013, in the countries that, it was just like 2 years after the old media structures are still in place, and like the big newspapers still being in favor of the autocratic regime. So that's something that is troubling our research. And of course, all autocratic regimes control the media because they want to control information. And so this whole approach of cognitive politicization is difficult in autocratic settings, but also in democratic settings in which, as you said, the media is too hegemonic. So, then it's difficult. So it's kind of a necessary condition that you say they must be informed about it. But if all newspapers are in the hands of the government or are related to the government in one way or the other, the aspect of cognitive politicization loses weight. And I think it is due to the fact that it was developed in more, democratic and freer societies in which you could assume that information is spread in a more neutral and pluralistic way. Yeah, I think I would say this. Yeah. Thanks.
Do you have any further question, Pak Fajar?
Enough from me, Mbak Jui.
Okay, thank you. So I will open the second part of Q&A sessions. it's really hard to choose because actually I have my own question, but I'll give a chance, a first chance to Ranata Dana, the second chance to Zarfans, and the third chance to Arfi, because Faiz has asked at every meeting since we start our 3-in-1 meeting. Faiz, will see if there's still time. I will give you a chance for you asking later. Okay, Ranata, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Jonas, I want to ask that I read your research about the Egypt and the Morocco, and I read that you distinguish between the rulers' claim and the citizens' claim side, and you stated by doing that, you could show the respective cries of the regime legitimacy through different dimensions, and thus requiring quite different political answers. And you said that by doing so, those micro foundations constitutes an empirical challenge. I don't get it, maybe because I'm just a early student. What kind of empirical challenge do you mean by that? Thank you very much.
Renata, thanks for the question. Really excellent, fantastic question. And it's not that easy. So, but let me try to explain it in this way, so that you have one side that is the ruling regime, and they have their propaganda material, their newspapers, their also education. So they have their different channels, how they communicate why they are legitimate. So that's the claim side. They say we stand for religion and tradition and national strength. The Chinese say we stand for socialism and capitalism. The Morocco government says we stand for traditional and religious values. So that's the one side. So that's what they say. And you could, in an empirical sense, you could read their texts and what they publish, and that you have an idea what they actually say. That's the one part. The second part is more the part what people, like the normal people, actually believe. And for getting to know what people believe, you would need to ask them. And now you have different ways of asking them. You could have an interview with them. So that would be very time consuming and you would get less people. But let's say you have a interview 10, 15 people. Or you make a survey, which is what we did, and ask these 1,500 people what they think and what they actually believe. So there's one side what the government says, and the other one is what the people actually believe. So, and in order for a government to be legitimate, these two, the claim, what they say, and the belief, what they hear, need to match. And this is the empirical challenge, that on the one hand, you would need to make sure that you find out what they say, and on the other hand, what people believe. And only if they match, then they are called legitimate. And if they do not match, then you have a problem. So, if a country or if a government says A, but people believe in B, then you have a mismatch, and then that's a problem. Then that's a crisis. So, and that's why we had a look in what does the government of Morocco and the government of Egypt say, and what is that the people actually believe. That was the you know, and this needs to match. This needs to match, and then we are only able to speak about legitimacy. Does this answer your question, Renata?
Maybe I want to sum it up in my words. So the main problem is to match these two things. That's the hard empirical problem, correct? Okay, thank you very much, sir, for the answer.
That's the main problem. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Zarvans.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. So after hearing your explanation, I appear with a simplified conclusion that in a ruling government, legitimacy is all that matters. So as long as you can provide what the people need, you got legitimacy, right? From what you have been taught to us. That means a stable government. So does it mean democracy is no longer the best option in current era? Because as we can see in Singapore, maybe one of the case study, the rapid growth is because one man decide what is the best for the country. Something applied to China or some other countries that still thriving with their autocracies to this day. And I think to gain those legitimacy through democracy, it requires a long time. Like maybe we can see the US and France, it requires them hundreds of years to perfecting their democracies, while it only takes decades for China or Singapore. And yes, my country used to have an autocracy government, and it fails maybe, but mostly because the international economic situation in the current time. So I think as long as the autocracy can give more than just bread to the people, it will thrive and bring stability, while democracy is a little boat in the middle of storm, maybe. That is my question to you. Is it, in summary, is democracy no longer the best option in current situation?
Thank you, Safans. That's a good question and a very relevant question that you asked. And now I'm a bit, so it's difficult for me to give an answer. So, you know, on a normative level, on a maybe also personal, my own personal conviction, it's clear for me that democracy, for a variety of reasons, is superior to any kind of autocratic regime. So that's a very normative statement that I say now as me as a person. So really like as a private opinion. But I guess that it's shared, I guess, among most or all of us. Now the point that you make, and that's a very troubling point to me, but a very kind of, it will be extremely important for the future, is that you have these countries that you mentioned, Singapore and China, but also other countries that are run autocratically, but that are very successful in economic terms. So the growth rates of China are still high, even if they lowered a bit. The economic prosperity of Singapore is huge. So to some people, not only in the countries themselves, not only for the Chinese and the Singaporeans, but also for others, this is almost a role model, so that they see that there is a success story that is out there, that you don't need to be democratic in order to provide economic growth. So that's very attractive to some people, but also to some other governments. So it is a big challenge, and it's a big rival in the political systems, and the rivalry will be with us for the next decades, I guess. So of course, I don't know how, you know, at one point China might democratize or might not. Now we currently observe rather a wave of autocratization, so a lot of countries becoming less democratic, whereas some years ago we saw a trend towards democratization, countries becoming more democratic. So I talk about this tomorrow, actually, about these trends that you see around the globe. So for, I don't know, here lots of examples also in Asia. So Philippines under Duterte becoming losing democratic quality and so on. So these are trends that happen. So it's still open to what extent China or Singapore or other countries will democratize, or other more democratic regimes will autocratize. That's open. But in any case, and that refers to the second part of your question about the time horizon, the time it takes to develop like these democratic norms. You know, there have been also, it's an excellent question, and really goes to the question to what extent a regime after it democratized consolidates as a democracy, like a young democracy maturing and kind of learning the rules. And it's a long process. Usually it's a sequential process. But there are a lot of examples where this transition was smooth and was successful. But even in a case like East Germany, the socialist Germany that became reunified with the democratic West Germany in 1989, even now 30 years later, there are no. So we just had the elections, as I told you. What you see is that the institutions, like the elections itself, they are not contested. So in a sense, East Germans, despite being socialized their whole life, or like the older generation, being socialized their whole life in an autocratic regime, and then having the transition to a democratic one, is that you see that they accept the democratic norms and the rules of the game, but that the votes for anti-democratic parties are higher, much higher than in the West, but both on the right wing and the left wing. So what I want to say is that institutions and like elections and parliaments and parties, that's easier to build, but it takes long that the ordinary citizens really get into the democratic game themselves. That takes longer. And actually, we had a study. Maybe I say this and then I continue with the Q&A. What we found in a study is that at your age of 15, what happens when you're 15? That's the most important year for your political opinion. Your political opinion will not change too much compared to what happens at your age of 15. So that's, in psychology, it's called the formative years. And if you experience at your age of 15 a kind of a democratic society, a free and open society, then the chances that you support this free and fair system are higher, are much better than when you're 15 and you grow up in a very repressive, very exclusionary regime. So that's troubling. If you grow up in an autocratic context at the age of 15, it's difficult to. I'm not saying it's impossible, but your political opinion is very sticky, so it remains unchanged. So, Sarfans, thanks a lot for the question.
Is that clear enough, Sarfans?
Yeah. Okay. It's enough, maybe. Thank you, Mr. Johannes, for the answer.
Okay, Arfi.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to ask, as you mentioned earlier about the manipulation of a dictator, in this case, I want to ask how do the authoritarian regime manipulate and mobilize the people to secure their rule, and how could they stay to have power? Like, how do they survive? That's all. Thank you.
Afi, great. Thanks for the question, and thanks for also taking. As I said, it's kind of courageous to speak up, and that is all for all of you before. So thank you for posing questions and for interacting. And the question you raise is very important, and I should have said a bit more about it maybe. So it's the question about how autocratic regimes mobilize their people, and in order to remain stable. And I think that's, and I'm happy that you asked this actually, because that's the book that I currently write and that I need to finish now. So that's the stability question is really one that is interesting to me. And as I said at the beginning, I'm particularly interested in the ordinary citizens, the normal people. And there are a lot of different channels that you see, how people or how autocracies manipulate the normal people. You know, very classic. So you might have these images in mind of these very mobilizing autocracies. So in Germany, you grow up with a lot of images, historical images of the Nazis, National Socialism, where you had these big parades, you know, people marching on the streets and enthusiastically shouting and cheering to the leader. And, you know, these kind of images of mobilized masses. And to some extent, this is true for some of the autocracies today, but mostly, you know, these excessive use of mobilization is not as strong as it used to be. So the parades and all these kind of things. But what happens is that you see a lot of, I have a colleague doing research on education, on school systems, on the curriculum, you know, how colored, how ideologically colored the school education is. So that's a more subtle, a more, but also, I guess, the same efficient way of doing things. But it's not an open mobilization, you know, but it's more educating people that they believe the ideologically right thing. Then of course you have all these newspapers and propaganda material, but I would rather say that they also speak more to the supporters. So you would not convince one who is not really a supporter with this type of propaganda material. But there are different ways to manipulate people. Now, a recent study found out that the Chinese, and I talk a lot about the Chinese, but they are really the most advanced in securing their power. So what they do is closely watched by a lot of people, by a lot of other autocratic governments. They say it's fine if people do dissent with the regime. So it's not the problem that people do not believe in it, but they intervene when people organize protests. That's the point where they really become active. So, you know, if they voice their criticism, that's totally fine. And what they did was an experimental study that was brilliant. They wrote, so it was kind of computer, so automatized. They wrote to all kinds of local politicians. I don't know how many, like thousands of them. And one email was just voicing dissent, saying, oh, we don't like the government and it's corrupt and so on. And on the other hand, the other group was getting an email, we don't like the government, it's corrupt, and we want to organize, and we organize protests. And the politicians, the government, reacted significantly higher, much more frequently to those who kind of voiced dissent, who not only voiced dissent, but who said that they're going to organize protest. That's the red line now. So you could voice dissent, sorry, but you could not say that you're going to protest. So that's, you know, that's now more the more kind of more intelligent way, actually, also that you allow for dissent, but you cut protest. Yeah, Avi, does this answer your concerns, your questions that you had?
Yes, it's clear enough. Thank you so much.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so we still have 17 minutes before 4 p.m. So I will give a chance for Faiz to ask the questions. Please, Faiz.
Hi, sir. I'm very sorry that I keep asking questions for the past 3 days.
No, I'm happy. So go ahead for the next 4 days as well. So no worries. Happy that
I'm also very interested in German political research because I also plan to really want to work in GPPI. You know, so yeah, this is something that is a valuable, chance. Okay, so before today, I actually got the chance to read one of your papers regarding the 3 pillars of stability towards an autocratic regime. In that paper, you mentioned that stability in autocratic regimes can be obtained through 3 pillars. Number 1, legitimation, 2nd, repression, and 3rd, cooptation. I would like to contextualize my question to the current pandemic situation, in which it has given a certain amount of rise in autocratic regimes or pseudo-authoritarian leaders like Viktor Orban from Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or even Jokowi in Indonesia, which we as students are very much repressed right now. In which these leaders are able to repress critics and aspirations, especially from the students. But in these countries, the COVID cases has steadily been declining, especially in Indonesia, for example. We have been going back to a sense of normalcy in which there's less COVID cases. My question is then, if these authoritarian leaders are able to tackle the pandemic of COVID-19 with their authoritarian ways, with their authoritarian policies, do you think this will even give an even much more legitimacy to their authoritarianism? Because like this, I feel like if they are able to tackle the pandemic with their authoritarian ways, I feel like this can justify their authoritarianism in the end of the day. Like, they feel like, oh, I am justified to do this. I'm justified to become an authoritarian leader because I was able to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think this can then contribute to the 3 pillars of stability that you mentioned in your paper earlier? Danke.
Yeah, Faiz, what to say? Excellent question. Thank you for this, and again, an excellent question. So please continue to ask your points. And also before I answer your question, if you said that you want to apply for the GPPI in Berlin, if you do, and if you think I could be of any help, then you could also just write me an email. That's also for the others. If you feel like that I could be of help, if you want to go to Berlin and do an internship or something, and you think I might be of help, then I could easily support your application. And for the GPPI, funnily enough, I know sort of friends working there, so that's I could just, if you want to apply, then, and if you think it would be helpful, then I'm happy to support you. You just need to send me an email. Kaszewski is such a unique name. It's easy to find me online. So just feel free to do, and it's the same for others here in the room. I'm happy to help here. On your COVID question, I think that's That's a good point. And I also had recently a similar online talk and conversation with colleagues about exactly what you just said about the question of to what extent autocratic regimes that have been very successful in dealing with the COVID crisis were gaining in legitimacy. So the example, or the people, the colleagues with whom I talked, was one a China expert and one on Iran. Now we know from the news that China was really successful and with very strong measures from very early on suppressing the spread. So, you know, curfews, bans, not able to travel, very long quarantines and so on. So, and they imposed it on the whole population. And it's true that they've been successful with this, because in this situation it was maybe the most necessary step in, you know, demobilizing people. And they could gain legitimacy by saying how much or how successful they've been in solving this problem, maybe better than democratic ones. Because in democratic societies, and I would be interested how it works in Indonesia, but for us in Germany, it was extremely difficult, and it is still very difficult to impose measures that are against your civil liberties. So you feel very uneasy if a government tells you you're not allowed to travel, you're not allowed to actually meet people, to go to restaurants, cinemas, and so on. So, you know, I'm totally saying that, don't get me wrong here, that's what's needed. So that's, you know, that's good. So there's no other way of doing it. So that's the way how to fight the pandemic. But still, you know, it kind of, you feel uneasy about these things because it hurts your civil liberties that you really, really cherish. Also, even more so about protests, about political protests. Should we allow for a political protest? Say Fridays for Future. Should we allow them to protest? And it's good that they protest. It's their right to protest. They need to voice their dissent with the government and make clear that they, you know, want more measures for climate change. On the other hand, you had concerns, okay, when they protest, will this be a spreading event? In Germany, these protests were allowed. Even the protests, all of the protests against COVID measures were allowed. And then, you know, it was kind of a paranoid situation almost, that you saw thousands of people protesting against COVID measures without face masks and, you know, very close to each other. And you thought, what's going wrong in your head? So what's happening? So you can't, so you really put yourself to risk by protesting against a virus. So it's just difficult to bear and difficult to tolerate. But yeah, that's the tension. So in such a situation where you need to have these measures, democracies have a harder time to impose these measures. But actually, I would say that if these measures are discussed publicly and if they are also controversially discussed, then this has a more long-term effect, that people now, or most of the people in a democratic society now really follow the rules and believe in the rules. So it's not only behavioral, that they, you know, not only that they do it, but that they're really persuaded, convinced of doing it. So in long term, democracies might be more successful. And maybe a very last word, I think the least successful have been the populists. So who, like the Trump and Bolsonaro and those people who base their rule on a very populist sentiment, they have been the least successful, I'd say. But no.
Okay, Faiz, do you have any further question, Faiz?
No, it's already very clear. Thank you very much, Dr. Johannes.
Okay, so it's 3:52 right now in Indonesia time. So I think that's all the Q&A sessions. We come to the end of our meeting, but before we close our meeting, Johannes, maybe you want to give a closing statement regarding to these topics.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just thank you. I think I don't need to sum up our discussions, but again, like yesterday, it's just very enriching to me. So I'm just extremely happy to be with you these days. So I thank you for the participation. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking about these topics while I spoke. And I hope that some of these things have been interesting to you. Some of them has been insightful to you. And I'm, as I said, so if you feel like I could be of help, just write me a note. I hope that I see some of you in the next days. So there will be other topics. So tomorrow we talk about autocratization, democratic decline. So countries like the US, like Hungary, like the Philippines, why they actually lose in democratic quality. So that will be the topic of tomorrow. And yeah, again, I really look forward to discussing this with you. So thank you for today, and look forward to see you tomorrow then. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to say thanks again, Johannes, for your great presentation today. And thank you to all the participants. Thanks for all your response, and thanks for all your attention. And see you again on the next meeting tomorrow. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you. Bye.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mister.
Sambil diisi ya absensinya.
Ya, presensinya tolong. Ini masih ada 100-an partisipan.
Besok Pak Fakih, Bu. Pak Fakih